This is URN.
Hello and welcome. This is University Radio Nottingham. We are live with The Big Picture. I am Felix Hawes. Joining us today we have two new guests. Scarlett.
Hello.
Hello, Scarlett. And Hannah.
Hello.
And I've heard he's graduated from a university which has also resulted in someone going to Oxford University. But this is James. Hello, James.
Glad to be back, Felix.
Always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much. So on today's show, we are talking about tanks in Ukraine, the BBC chairman scandal and the Boris Johnson loan, and Nadhim Zahawi not quite paying enough tax. But first of all, we will be talking about Ukraine. So Germany, after weeks of pressure from its allies, has finally allowed tanks to go from its country, but also allowing other countries who have tanks that are leased from Germany to send them to Ukraine as well, such as Poland and the Netherlands. So the pressure was put on Germany because it was thought that tanks were needed in Ukraine urgently before a second set of mobilisation occurs from Russia, which is expected later on in the year. Germany were dragging its feet a little. To the panel, what do you think these tanks going to Ukraine will do? Do you think it will actually make any difference? And what are your assessments of the current situation in Ukraine? James, let's go with you first.
Well, I think it's quite significant to remember, I guess, that this is almost coming up to now the 1 year anniversary to the start of the war. I think was it February, March last year was when the war first started, and I don't know, it's sort of a bit odd to think about that this has been going on for like a year now. I think the tanks will make a significant impact. Again, I'm not really an expert on military matters, so I can't go into specifics, but the stuff like this will obviously have a major impact, especially with Ukraine trying to push Russia out of the rest of the country, because Ukraine had quite a lot of success over the past year, but for the past couple of months that success has sort of slowed down. It's become more entrenched. Russia's beginning to slowly recuperate. So I think, yeah, I mean, given the tanks, I guess. I think it's interesting that Olaf Scholz held out so long in not giving the tanks, and I think it sort of brings up a lot of important points to remember about how giving aid to Ukraine becomes a very political issue within very different countries. We assume that in the UK, because the attitude is almost overwhelmingly pro-Ukrainian, but there is quite a large amount of Germans who are not pro-Russian, but are a little bit more questionable. I believe there was a poll just before Christmas that 40% of Germans understand how NATO is to blame for the war because of NATO expansion towards Russia. I think a lot of Germany, especially East Germany, has been shown to be quite susceptible to Russian disinformation and misinformation about it. So I can understand why it took Scholz so long to end up actually sending the tanks, because it is an interesting domestic political divide that he needs to balance, while in the UK it does, and I'm assuming most of the panel would agree, it does seem like a given, give Ukraine what they need to, succeed in repelling the invaders, but in each individual country it becomes its own domestic problem.
That's a very interesting point, and following on from that, 2/3 of the German population, just before Olaf Scholz announced that they were going to send tanks, opposed sending any more military aid or that significant military aid to Ukraine. That has now Olaf Scholz has made that decision. There is more support of the German population in backing the government, but it's still not the overwhelming amount of support Ukraine has in this country, where only 12% of the population in a recent poll conducted a few weeks ago, I believe, opposed the government helping Ukraine. Hannah, what do you think? Do you agree with James? And what do you make of Germany's sort of reluctance? Bearing in mind, Germany also was hesitant in cutting off its energy supplies from Russia. It also blocked RAF and other planes flying over German airspace to help Ukraine. It was also, again, reluctant about suspending Russia from the sort of international currency exchange mechanisms. I can't remember the institution that it was at the time, but it has a history of this. But that being said, Germany is, after the USA and the UK, the next biggest supporter in terms of total finance given to Ukraine. But what do you think to this?
Well, I do agree. I think that the tanks will make a big difference because, it's the biggest part of weaponry that's been sent so far. It was interesting that Germany took so long to respond. I guess that just again shows the sort of difference in attitude with some countries because, as was said before, the UK is obviously so predominantly pro-Ukraine, but it's interesting to see the cultural differences. One thing I would say is, whilst I know it will be really useful, President Zelensky has said that it's absolutely urgent that these tanks get there as soon as possible. And I can't remember which country it was, but I read in the news that there was a country that said it might not get to Ukraine. The tanks might not get to Ukraine for another 3 months, which, President Zelensky views as too long. So I think the timescale will be a big determiner of how effective the tanks are. And then playing devil's advocate a little bit, I remember hearing of some concerns that the use of, sending more tanks by these countries might anger Putin even more. So some people slightly worried that could influence his, decision to activate nuclear weapons because he, with the more support that Ukraine gets, the more intense support from the countries, he might get more angry, and obviously he doesn't think rationally. So I don't personally believe that, but that's sort of the other side of the argument, I think.
That's an interesting point, and that has been made by some right-wing commentators and some former Jeremy Corbyn supporters as well. I think I read I can't remember what position he had in Jeremy Corbyn's office, but it was making the point about trying to find peace, which in his words would mean Ukraine surrendering territory to Russia to stop it. But that is certainly a view held by some corners of Britain and more wildly thought of in other countries such as Germany. You mentioned there, Hannah, about the tanks and about how long it would take for them to get there. Well, I believe that Macron promised tanks a long time ago, and I don't believe that his tanks are there. And it's also interesting to note, again, with different levels of support from different countries, that although France has been a bigger supporter of Ukraine, at least in rhetoric, than Germany, France, despite having also a similar sized economy to the UK, has spent 10 times less money on Ukraine aid, that's military and other forms of humanitarian aid, than the UK, which is interesting. Scarlett, do you have anything to add on Germany and the wider consequences of these tanks going to Ukraine?
Just on the point about Zelensky wanting the tanks, he's wanted them since April, and I don't know when France exactly promised to send them, but the fact that they still haven't got there, I think it's a real shame, because it's domestic politics overtaking some really what should be done in the situation. Actually looking at it, I don't know if they necessarily, whether these tanks will make a dramatic difference. Again, I'm not a military expert. I did listen to some sort of high-ranking member of the army speaking on the news, and he said yes, they'll make a massive difference, but it's hard to know. He says until they're in the theatre of war, it'll be hard to know how they operate. On the German question, I believe Scholz was delaying sending the tanks until Biden agreed to send his as well, and they both made the announcement on the same day. And I believe that Scholz was dragging his feet because Germany historically does not want to be seen as the aggressor, and the speech that Scholz made last year talking about raising the amount of GDP that Germany percentage of GDP that Germany contribute towards their defence has increased for the first time. And I think very much the type of character Scholz is, he does not want to make it seem as if Germany is getting ready to increase dramatically their military. So I don't obviously send the tanks. I don't think anyone on the panel is sort of disagreeing with that. But as I believe James was discussing, this is all more about the political impact in each domestic country as opposed to the true way this will help Ukraine in the theatre of war, which I think we yet to be seen.
That's an interesting point. And again, as you and James said earlier, the historical context of the country matters. Germany with World War and East Germany being governed by communists in the sphere of influence of the then Soviet Union has mattered in terms of public support now. Poland, which is governed by quite a right-wing government, which if looking at the trends would suggest it wouldn't support Ukraine as much as other countries, actually is one of the strongest supporters. They were putting a lot of pressure on Germany to send tanks, and although they needed German permission to send tanks from themselves, because they were leasing them from Germany, they said that even if Germany didn't give them permission, they'd still send the tanks anyway. So there's interesting dynamics going on in terms of the support over Ukraine. Germany, Poland, the UK, the US, Norway, Canada, France and the Netherlands have all promised tanks so far, and Spain are considering it. To the panel again, the war, as James I think noted, has stalled in terms of movement of who owns what land currently. Do you see this war ending by the time we reach the second anniversary of the invasion, or do you think that actually really it's going to be ongoing? When I say the war, I mean the current version of the war of Russia versus Ukraine. I imagine there will still be the insurgent separatist movements that existed before Russia invaded last February. But what do you think will happen this year? What are your predictions for the war? Shall we start with you this time, Scarlett, if that's okay?
Yes, so I think it actually depends a lot on how well these tanks operate. So the reason that Zelensky wants these tanks is because he believes they will help retake these cities that the Russians currently have. So I don't know, I'm not an expert on warfare, and I think it's yet to be seen whether the Russians can launch this spring offensive, try and, I assume, take back some cities around sort of first anniversary. By the second anniversary, I think ultimately it depends on how much aid the Western world gives to Ukraine, and I'd say the Republicans in the USA are currently stalling a lot on aid. They think they've given enough, and without the support of the Americans, I don't know how the Ukrainians can survive. I think, especially since next year is a presidential year, there's another US election. It will be very interesting to see around sort of, when the candidates start making themselves known, running in each of the primaries, and sort of around the time that second anniversary, whether there's an argument of whether the Americans should be giving any more aid to Ukraine at all, and I think that will ultimately determine whether the war continues or not.
That's an interesting point about the Republicans and the backing, and of course, yes, if this war goes on for 3 years and a Republican wins the presidency, perhaps Trump, there might be a different international support might change quite heavily. The USA is overwhelmingly the largest contributor in aid to Ukraine. Of course, it also has a lot of money to be able to do that. But that is a very interesting point about the international support. We have a new government in Italy, for example, which many members are pro-Putin or Putin sympathetic. So there are, and of course Hungary is also in the EU, which has a lot of Putin sympathies. So it is interesting to see when financial burdens continue, whether or not that level of support will change and how that will affect Ukraine. Hannah, what do you think about the war and what's likely to happen over the next year?
I mean, the optimist in me wants to say, yes, it will be finished by the second anniversary. I mean, the amount the Ukrainians have withstood a lot longer than a lot of people expected. So that is something to take, comfort in. But the realist in me isn't sure, because as Scarlett was saying, the international aid could change. If the Republican, someone like Trump, does get into power again in America, I can't see the aid being as rigorous. I hope that I'm wrong, but I can't see that it being as rigorous. I also think a lot of it depends on how Putin responds to the increase in aid around the world. It will either threaten him, I think, and make him want to retreat and think he's not going to win, or, it could spur him on. I really hope this doesn't happen, but, the anger could turn on other countries as well if the aid continues. So I'd like to think yes, but I would probably say no at this point, unfortunately.
Interesting, and again, what you say there about Putin and what's he going to do. I mean, I saw some commentators saying that it's a bit like the First World War, that you kill a load of Russian soldiers and then the same number of them just appear, like a war of attrition in a way. James, what do you think to the comments made by Scarlett and Hannah and the broader question of what's going to happen this year?
I think quite an interesting dynamic is sort of developed in the Russia is sort of waiting for is sort of in a waiting game, right? It doesn't want to. It can keep on getting more troops, sending them right to the border, but its supplies are like running out. They're using very old equipment. The Russian army, they're beginning to really get to the recruit anyone sort of stage kind of thing to keep troops on the fronts. So it's sort of an interesting dynamic of like, can Russia outlast Western aid? I think because, as has been said, the Republicans are going to cut down if they win the presidency. Are going to cut down on aid to Ukraine massively. There's a risk that as the war drags on and the economies across the Western world begin to, slow down, there's a risk that a lot of countries, even the more pro-Ukrainian countries, maybe in 6 months, a year's time, begin to say, this is getting a bit much, we can't afford to do this anymore. So it's sort of the interesting dynamic of whether Russia can outlast the Western aid, whether eventually the Republicans win the presidency, Western aid begins to run dry, and then Russia can finally push through and make a deal. I don't think, at least, this does all sound very pessimistic of me, but I don't think that, as was worried about in the very early weeks of the war, the whole of Ukraine is going to be taken by Russia. I don't think that's possible at all. I fear that the most likely outcome is if Western aid runs out, if the Republicans take the presidency, Western countries slow down on aid, maybe next year a peace deal is forced to be made because Ukraine can't keep going, where Ukraine has to give up the Donbass and has to relinquish their claim on Crimea and stuff, which is obviously the worst, or not the worst, but one of the worst things that could occur. But I do fear that that's sort of the most realistic if Western aid runs out. I think if the West can stay united on it, or as united as they have been on it, and if aid continues to come through, and maybe Russia begins to actually run out and realize that this isn't realistic at all, some better peace could be made. But I don't see much good happening in 2023, to be honest. The future is bleak, in my opinion.
Well, there we are. Hopefully James is wrong, but we will see. Before we take our musical break, I will just like to make some notices. So first of all, you can comment into the show. If you go to University Radio Nottingham on the online platform, you can message in and we can read out your comments, your thoughts on today's show. Also, do check out earlier episodes of The Big Picture on Spotify. They're all there now. That's The Big Picture. That's just its name. And you can type in my name, Felix. That should be enough to find it. There are lots of big pictures. Obviously, there's only one true great big picture, which is this one.
I very much agree, Felix.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, well, we're here. We'll have a musical break now. I was hoping that this would be Russia's Waterloo. I think the panel would agree. But we don't have Waterloo in the system anymore, so we'll have to make do with this.
This is URN.
Hello and welcome back to The Big Picture. I'm Felix Hawes. Our second topic is the BBC and the scandal involving our former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So, it has been revealed recently that Richard Sharp, who is the chairman of the BBC, before he was appointed, had helped organise a loan of about £80,000 for Boris Johnson when he was then Prime Minister. So this has opened up a can of worms of corruption. So that, I suppose, is our main highlight of this topic, is corruption under the Johnson government and the BBC and impartiality, which it has to be. So, Hannah, I'll go to you first. What do you make of this story? What are your initial thoughts?
I mean, I think it's important to sort of wait until the investigation is done to learn the full truth, really. But on the face of it, it doesn't look great. And I think the fact that there was even if because Richard Sharp said he wasn't directly involved in organising the loan, and that it was discovered that there was a conflict of interest, and they both, it was agreed that he wouldn't go any further with it. Even sort of the involvement in the Prime Minister's finances itself is quite dodgy, I think. So I don't know. I'm quite conflicted about it, because it depends how much assistance was actually given and how much involvement there was. So I think I'll probably reserve my full opinion until investigation's been done, but I think there was a lot of corruption, as we know, in the Johnson government, so I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if this comes to be true. I don't think he should have to resign at the moment. I think he should be able to stay, innocent until proven guilty. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it unfolds.
Interesting. I think that's probably what the government line's going to be as well, to wait until the investigation's occurred. James, what do you make to this?
Oh, it's all a little bit corrupt, I think, in my opinion. I think if you just look at the situation, right, it's all a bit dodgy, this multi-millionaire, I think Sam Blythe or whatever, I think is his name, goes
distant cousin of Boris
Johnson. Hears through the grapevine that the Prime Minister, is struggling with his finances, and goes to Sharp to help set up a meeting with Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, someone who I'll go into later. Goes to set up a meeting with him for the exact purpose of this loan. It would be bad enough if Sharp introduced Blythe to Simon Case, just with no idea about the loan. That's still a bit dodgy. And then not bringing that up during him going for the job as head of the BBC, that would have been dodgy enough. But the fact that Sharp knew that he was helping out because Blythe wanted to give a loan to Boris Johnson is all a bit much. I think the idea of a almost £1 million loan to the Prime Minister because the Prime Minister is suffering from his finances is an obvious massive risk of just being bribery, of trying to gain influence with the Prime Minister through through money, which is literally corrupt. I don't know. I think waiting for the full investigation is not necessarily, in my opinion, obviously, because I'm even less a fan of the Tories. So I think just from the facts that we already know and that has been confirmed by Sharp, I think he made a statement to all the employees of the BBC where he did confirm that he helped facilitate this loan kind of thing. I think that's enough to sort of be pretty corrupt. And I also think that even if the investigation finds nothing punishable, they don't get rid of Sharp, I think the reputational damage that has been done to the BBC is already done. There's already, even if Sharp sticks around and is found to not really be at fault, there's still reputational damage done to an organisation which tries to be an unbiased, source of information that many people see as this, they can trust the BBC to report sort of most of the facts. Well, can they really if, the head of the BBC might have, facilitated bribes to the Prime Minister? Not saying that's obviously what happened, but people will begin to think that, and then faith is lost in the BBC, and then it's all just a bit bad, isn't it?
That's a point I think I will bring up again, James, in a minute once I've got Scarlett's opinion about the BBC and the implications it's had on them. But Scarlett, first of all, what do you think about the way this has been done and the alleged allegations of, I suppose that is what an alleged means, alleged allegations to about Boris Johnson and the corruption of his government and the links to this and the appointment?
Yeah, so I believe that the public inquiry is a delaying tactic. I believe that Richard Sharp should resign as BBC chairman. I think it's ridiculous that someone in this position of power in our media has given £400,000 to the Conservative Party. I do not think it's necessarily just about the Tories. There have previously been BBC chairmen that have donated money to the Labour Party. I think this is an issue of why is a supposedly politically neutral media organisation at the top level having people who have who have paid significant amounts of money and are donors of our political parties. His role is to organise the strategic direction of the BBC. He was on the interview panel for the head of news, despite making his political affiliation very, very clear. So the idea that he is now involved in corruption, that he facilitated this loan, I think is wrong, and I think that he should resign. And I'm very much confused about why Rishi Sunak has not taken the step. But then I learned that he was Rishi Sunak's boss at Goldman Sachs, and suddenly it all started making sense.
So they all knew each other before. Interesting. So, Scarlett, you mentioned there about the BBC and former chairs of the BBC donating to the Labour Party. I mean, there have been allegations before, the other way around, when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, that the chair then was an ally of his, Gavin Davis, and also Greg Dyke, who was the Director General of the BBC, I think probably before Lord Hall, who was the one before Tim Davie, the current one, was again an ally of Blair on his appointment. And the chair of the BBC is often a political appointment for an impartial body that might lead to some questions. But I thought an interesting question to ask the panel, as we do have a diverse ideological panel here, is often the BBC is accused of breaking its impartiality and being biased. But interestingly, this is what is often said by both those on the left and those on the right, and really can both be true at the same time, or maybe so. That's what I want to find out from you. So to the panel, do you believe the BBC is biased, or is it actually fulfilling its impartiality if both sides are accusing it, or is certain corners of the BBC biased one way and other corners of the BBC biased another? What do you think? I'll start with you, Scarlett, this time.
I love the BBC. I think it's one of the best institutions we have in this country, but it often doesn't help itself, is what I'd say. It aims to be impartial, but in the sense of sometimes I feel like they don't choose the most centrist angle. Instead, they give one story will be more right-leaning, one will be left-leaning, and then you look at the whole website and the way they arrange their articles on their website as a whole, and it balances itself out. But I don't find that each individual story necessarily is impartial. And I think I'd mention this story about this rapist, which apparently their main personality trait is that they're trans, and this has been part of the whole debate about what prison they should go in, whether they should go into the women's prison or into just a general prison with men, despite being a trans woman. And this was at the top of the BBC News website for a few days. It was above Zahawi's tax issues, which we'll come on to later. And although this is a growing issue because of Section 35 and is quite as part of the culture wars at the moment, I felt that was sort of placing it where it did on the news website was sort of pandering to the right, where, and I think the Zahawi tax issues are to an extent more important, and I would have rearranged the website, and I believe that sort of putting it as the top headline was part of the BBC's way of impartiality, the way they've conducted impartiality, which is trying to balance the left and the right, whereas why not just be neutral? Why? Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, I suppose, though, if they put Zahawi's tax scandal first, others might say, well, hang on a minute, why is this first and not the story that you mentioned? And I think that's the issue. I think of a lot of different people will come with different versions of what the BBC should be doing and what is a priority. This is the interesting point that we're making now of different views, and that's an interesting point you've come across here, Scarlett, that you think that some articles do lean to the left and some do lean to the right. James, what do you think?
Well, I would echo what's been said. I love the BBC. I think that's pretty damn good as both a concept and in execution. I think a lot of this idea that the BBC is very left-leaning, I think in part does come from like the shows they make more than the actual news they report. I think a lot of the shows and the comedy shows and stuff they make the people are generally more left-wing. So I think it becomes easy to say that the left wing has a BBC. The BBC has a left-wing bias. Sorry, because of stuff like that. I think news-wise, I would personally say that as an organisation, it's not biased one way or the other. I do think that it sometimes, as Scarlett said, sort of tries to balance out both sides and ends up sort of boosting up one thing too much, playing down other things that are like arguably more important, as an attempt to try and like balance both left wing and right wing. I think, though, as an organisation, it's not inherently biased. I think that individuals might be, in the sense of people like Laura Kuenssberg. I think there was a lot of rumours way back when Boris was still around that, you know, her relationship with him was close, and she kind of gave him the benefit of the doubt more. Every once in a while I'll see a report that she's made that seems to be giving the Tories a bit more of the benefit of the doubt than anything. And I think so. I think individually you might have people who might lean very slightly one way or the other, but I don't think at all as an organisation it's inherently biased. I don't even think that's really a bad thing. I think it's impossible to have journalists be completely non-biased all the time, you know. So yeah, I think it's overall it's not a biased organisation.
That's a very interesting point. And you say about different commentators, and we know from the fact that because the BBC has lost a lot of its journalists, which way they do lean. So Andrew Neil, for example, that briefly left to run GB News, chair of GB News, but left that. Clearly he's on the right, but also you've got Andrew Marr, who's now the political editor of The New Statesman, which suggests that he is centre-left. Interestingly, a point that Andrew Marr has made about the BBC is that he said it has a liberal bias, not because of sort of political leanings, but more of the culture of the BBC because of who works there. London cosmopolitans are more likely to be liberal, and that was a point that he made, and he is on the centre-left. So he said it wasn't a political bias, just more of a cultural one. Hannah, what do you think?
I'm going to take a slightly different stance. I really don't see the bias, and maybe I'm wrong because I do take the points of Scarlett and James, but to be honest, I don't really see it. I see occasional stories, you know, or reporters that I sometimes can tell their opinions, but obviously that's going to happen because everyone's human, everyone has their opinions. The example of Laura Kuenssberg, I really don't see that. I think she's very neutral, but again, I guess it is just perception. But just going back slightly to Richard Sharp, and some points that were made earlier, I think for me the big issue, I don't really have an issue with the fact that he's openly supports the Conservatives as long as that doesn't impact how he runs the organisation. So I think, you know, I don't really, because everyone has political opinions, I don't really have an issue with that. I have more of an issue, you know, of how he was appointed and if that was to do with his association with Boris Johnson. That's the bigger issue for me. So it's a slightly separate point, but I just thought I'd just bring that in. But yeah, it is interesting to think about bias because I know, like you've mentioned, a lot of journalists have left the BBC, and I know Emily Maitlis she did a lecture where she suggested that there was some Tory bias in the BBC, which was quite interesting to listen to from an insider's perspective. I personally don't see it, but I don't work there, and I know everyone has their own perceptions. But as Scarlett and James have said, I love the BBC. I think its coverage is fantastic. So I don't see it, but that's just my own opinion.
Well, that's interesting. You mentioned Emily Maitlis there because I found it interesting when she said that too about sort of it was run by Conservatives, and I found it ironic that she was making this point when John Sopel and Lewis Goodall, who are now all run a podcast, The News Agents, together, were all involved in the BBC and they're all left-leaning. So it was interesting that she said that there was that bias. So I think overall, and I'm pleased I asked this question because it has reflected exactly what I expected, is that it really the point of view of whether or not the BBC is biased really just depend on everyone's own perceptions of reality. A lot of people have said what James has said there about Laura Kuenssberg, and others don't see it either. So it's interesting. I suppose I don't really know how you would measure it, but it's certainly an interesting one to discuss. We did Scarlett, yes, go on.
Just on the Emily Maitlis thing, I disagree with her in the sense of maybe a bias towards the Conservatives. I think the BBC have an establishment bias where whoever's in power, they obviously have more contacts with the journalists, know the politicians better, and that's why they give them more. They are more favourable, as opposed, and I'm sure that because the same accusations were made against the BBC during Labour governments. I think look at how long it's coming up to 13 years the Tories have been in power, and they're running out of MPs to put in their cabinet, as we well know, given the quality of some of them. So I think that it's more of an establishment thing than necessarily the Tories, and then perhaps Labour will get in for another 10 years and they'll have the same accusations against them, and we won't be the ones sitting here, but our replacements in 10 years' time might be discussing the same thing from the other's perspective.
Well, Scott, you never know, I might still be here. I mean, I'm already here 2 years, but longer than I thought I would be on the big picture. So So, thank you very much for all your brilliant thoughts. We did have a question that came through, which is what's playing right now? Well, that was Dancing Queen without the lyrics. I hope you sang along at home to fill in the rest of it. But we will have the lyrics to the next song, which is a request by Hannah, who, like someone else who's a Conservative, Liz Truss, is a fan of Taylor Swift. So here we go.
This is URN.
Hello and welcome back to The Big Picture. We are live on University Radio Nottingham, and this is our third and final part where we are talking about Nadhim Zahawi. So Nadhim Zahawi is the chair of the Conservative Party. He's had many different roles. He was the vaccines minister, then he was the education secretary. Then he said to Boris Johnson allegedly that if you don't make me Chancellor of the Exchequer following Rishi Sunak's resignation, I will resign. So he was made Chancellor, and then a day later told Boris Johnson that he would resign again if forced Boris Johnson out, basically. And he's now the chair of the Conservative Party. Now, it's come about that he accidentally mislaid £3.7 million, as I'm sure many of the panel can sympathise with. And he's had to pay that money back to His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, where he paid a penalty. Now, Zahawi gave back this money that he accidentally didn't pay them when he was Chancellor, which means he did this when he was in charge of His Majesty's Revenue and Customs. So eyebrows have raised. He said it was an honest mistake. He's paid the money back. Job's done. However, HMRC have said honest mistakes don't tend to lead to penalties. Now, at the moment, there's an investigation. Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has said that Zahawi has questions to answer, yet he's remaining in place. Both Sunak and Hunt have both been asked by the press about their own taxes, and both of them did not give an answer straight away of saying, no, I haven't mislaid any of my taxes. Later they did confirm that they haven't had to pay any penalties to HMRC, but it took them a while to say it, which is perhaps a note of the briefings and communications of the current government. Jeremy Hunt, the current Chancellor, has said that he will release his tax returns at some point. So what do we make to this? I mean, this is another legacy of the Johnson era that is creeping up on Sunak. Scarlett, what do you make of this?
I believe that Rishi Sunak should have already sacked Nadhim Zahawi. I don't understand why he's still here. Yes, his role as vaccine minister was adequate. You know, he didn't destroy the whole thing. He didn't spend billions and billions of pounds on PPE, as Matt Hancock did. But he's not. I understand the role he plays within the Conservative Party and the support he has, but he's literally a tax avoider, and he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I think we need to talk about the standards we have of our politicians and the ones that Rishi Sunak has talked about himself in respect of integrity and accountability, and he's not holding Nadhim Zahawi to account, is he? He's just simply saying, oh, there's going to be another inquiry, but whatever. That's not good enough. You know, this has been so many politicians, mostly all from Boris Johnson's government, who just think they can make a laughing stock out of the public. And I personally think, you know, he should have been sacked as soon as this news first came out. There's no way that Rishi Sunak did not know about this, even if he says he doesn't. How can you, as the Prime Minister, former Chancellor, someone who's very influential in the Tory party, not know about this? And I think it shows a lot about perhaps Rishi Sunak doesn't have this sort of political aptitude for being Prime Minister, because how can he seriously think, after being in Boris Johnson's government and looking at the way that, you know, the public has responded to all this corruption, to think that the same thing's not going to happen to him? He can't just preach about integrity and assume the public is going to be okay with it just because on the face of it he appears nicer and more like he wants to solve the problem than Boris Johnson did, which is at least how he comes across to me, because he's doing the same thing Boris Johnson did. Oh, there'll be an inquiry, it'll all get sorted out. It makes me angry, to be honest, because we should not have such like, because when the news came out, I wasn't actually surprised. Somehow I wasn't. I was like, oh, it's just another member of Boris Johnson's cabinet that is just it's disappointed me.
I wonder how many inquiries there are currently
Well, there's one into Dominic Raab.
Yes, 24 civil servants now.
Yeah, there's one into, I believe, Gavin Williamson. There was a Priti Patel bullying scandal, of course.
There's Boris Johnson and whether he lied about Partygate, which is going to be happening as well. So a lot of inquiries. Scarlett, you did make a point there about how Rishi Sunak wanted to distance himself from from the Johnson government. And one of the things that the Johnson government did that previous governments of both colours hadn't done is this sort of lack of forcing anyone to resign. I mean, if we look back to the sort of Tony Blair administration, you could as much breathe in the wrong place and you'd be fired.
Exactly. Look at what happened to Peter Mandelson.
Yeah, sacked twice, and then he still came back for more. But Hannah, what do you make of this? Do you think that this is waiting for the inquiry, the due process? Do you think that's the right thing to do? And even if it is the right thing to do, in terms of the structure of the regime, Rishi Sunak might be saying, look, I want to follow the rules. But do you think actually, in hindsight, this is not the greatest idea because it links back to the Johnson regime? And looking at the polls, the Conservatives are now sort of back to where they were when Liz Truss was Prime Minister. What do you think to this?
Yeah, my opinion of this has actually changed the more I've read about it. When I first read about it, I thought, like Scarlett said, I actually wasn't surprised. But I also thought, when I first read it, okay, it's a really stupid mistake, but perhaps if he's paid up, we should give him another chance. However, the more I've read into it, and I've actually looked at sort of his history, and there have been other investigations into his taxes before, and the very fact that this happened when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer is pretty much a disgrace, really. I don't necessarily blame Rishi Sunak for it, because it didn't happen under his reign, and I do agree that there should be a process gone through. I do agree with that. But I just think it's just all very shady in the fact that he has been investigated before. It's not like this is a clean slate and a one-time mistake. And also the fact that they've said, they wouldn't have fined him if it had just been an innocent mistake. And, we had a Chancellor who couldn't handle his own tax affairs, which is very worrying. I also think the fact as well that he's the chair of the Conservative Party means that at the moment, he's supposed to be the person who goes on to do interviews to advertise the party and promote it. And he can't really do that at the moment because all he's going to be asked about if he goes on an interview is this tax scandal. So yeah, as I said, my opinions changed quite a lot. I was more sympathetic with him to start with, but then the more I've looked into it, I think we should wait. I personally think the process should be gone through before he is sacked. But for me, it is all about timescale as well. If this is going to take months and months and months, I do think he should probably step aside because he can't fulfil his responsibilities in this role. If it is just going to be the matter of a week, I'd say he should stay in the post until then and see what the result is. But I don't really see how he can stay on after this, because it's just again something that damages the party's reputation. And if they want to have any hope at all of recovering in the polls before the next election, then they really need to step up, because at the moment Rishi Sunak's pledge for integrity, professionalism, I can't remember what the other word was, but it's not really going down too well at the moment. We've talked about how many MPs are under investigation at the moment. Rightly or wrongly, whatever the outcome is, it still really doesn't look good, the fact that there even has to be an investigation in the first place.
Thank you, Hannah. James, what's your view on this?
Oh, it's just ridiculous, isn't it? The Chancellor of the country, paying back taxes that he didn't pay while he's Chancellor. Come on. That is so... I basically agree with everything Scarlett said. I think we should hold our politicians to at least some standard, that we can't just be fine with the Chancellor paying back tax revenues in the millions. This isn't even like a minor few £100 that was missing from a business, or a few £1,000 even from a business. This is in the millions, that was missing. This is completely ridiculous. So I do think he's got to go. I do think eventually he will go. But I do think, in a way, the more interesting point is, why is Sunak keeping him, right? he doesn't really command a strong faction within the party. We saw that in the leadership election to replace Boris. Zahawi went for it and was like the first one out, I think. So he doesn't command a lot of support. He's not charismatic. We've seen that when he's done the media rounds. He's not exactly good at it, though none of them really are. He isn't amazingly competent. He was vaccines minister, but I feel like that was more the people under him rather than anything he particularly did well. So I think it's sort of interesting as why is he being kept along then? What is so valuable about him that he isn't just fired and this scandal has been allowed to last so long? And I do think also there was probably knowledge of this tax issue. When MPs are vetted to be ministers and stuff, they're vetted by ethics committees and stuff like this. Something like this would have come up most likely, or as Hannah said, other issues that Zahawi's had in the past with his finances would have come up, and yet not like all three of the recent prime ministers, and again, crazy to say all three of them, all three of the recent prime ministers decided to give him a ministerial post anyway. I think it is very, very poor form, in my opinion. As I said earlier, quite ridiculous.
Can I just also add as well, another thing that kind of troubled me about it was that Rishi Sunak, I think it was a couple of Prime Minister's questions ago, when Keir Starmer questioned him about it, he'd said that he thought that everything was, I can't remember what his words were, but basically he thought that all the procedures had been followed and everything was fine. And then, matter of days later, he'd said, new information has come to light, then we're going to have an investigation. I think the very fact that new information came to light shows that Nadhim Zahawi wasn't honest from the start. So, the fact that he didn't give all of the information to start with is worrying in itself. So I feel like that just adds insult to injury, really.
Yeah, and about the idea of his competency as a vaccine minister. My driving instructor's partner is the head of pathology in the UK, and she said, he did nothing. Yeah, he was the typical manager who just made sure like everything was running decently, but it was the work of the people in the NHS. It's the same situation with Matt Hancock. I mean, he doesn't get the credit for, obviously, for the way the pandemic was held.
And if you listen to Dominic Cummings, he didn't get any credit at all.
Yeah.
Go on,
but I think it's important to note that these come from the founders, the money that is not being paid the tax on is from the founders' shares of the polling company YouGov. And this was sort of something, sometimes stuff comes up on Twitter and I'm like, you're sort of overblowing it. But I think it's quite important that for one of the biggest polling companies in the country was founded and still obviously has the influence of somebody that is in government. And because to an extent, we don't really trust the polls as much as we do anymore because often they are untrue or unrepresentative. But we still use them and we also always talk about them. So I find it interesting that sort of we're talking about political affiliation and the way that these supposedly neutral things, like you'd assume a polling company should be, was literally founded by the current and hopefully soon no longer Conservative chairman. And I would also like to point out that Rishi Sunak's wife and the Chancellor before him, Javid, were also non-doms. So I love the standard of our chancellors in the country at the moment.
Well, we've had plenty to look at, haven't we, chancellors recently. Interestingly, though, YouGov was the most accurate at predicting the general election in 2017. I think it was one of the most accurate in 2019. But it's an interesting backstory of Nadhim Zahawi. Another interesting backstory of Nadhim Zahawi that I looked at was when he was involved in a serious bike accident when he'd been hit, I think, by a car. The police and ambulances came whilst he was on the ground with the bike, and a traffic warden decided to give him a fine because he wasn't allowed to park his bike where he'd been hit. And he was very angry about this. He was interviewed by, I think it was the BBC or ITV, and he said that he didn't want to pay them. So maybe that's the link to where the 3.7 million later came. I mean, there we are. Just before we wrap up, James, you did make a point about why is Sunak keeping him. Zahawi is, despite what some of the comments made by the panel about maybe his competency is exaggerated about the vaccines minister. But regardless of that, it is seen actually on a sort of cross-party basis that he was seen as a competent vaccines minister and is regarded in the party. He might not have the level of following that others have, but he's influential, let's say, or it could be argued that he's influential. And he is a Johnson supporter. There have been many reports, almost a different one each week, that Johnson and his big supporters like Nadine Dorries and Jacob Rees-Mogg are plotting Johnson's return, that Sunak might worry that Zahawi on the backbenches might cause him some damage. Do you think there's any truth behind that, or do you think that the reasons for not sacking him are different? James, what do you think?
To be honest, I don't really think that Zahawi has that much power within the party. I think he is arguably influential in the sense that, yes, he did sort of help push Boris along the resignation when that happened, but I think he's a man who very much wants to have influence in the party, as we saw from him becoming Chancellor for 2 days and then telling Boris to go, him trying to build up a base to become leader and then inevitably failing. I think he's someone who wants to have a large influence, but I don't think he really, compared to people like Liz Truss, who depressingly is somehow creating, has got a faction backing her quite a lot now of MPs who are saying that the ideas were fine, the timing was just wrong, and the implementation was just wrong. Nadhim Zahawi is no Liz Truss, and that is a very odd sentence to say. The bar is truly through the floor here. But I don't think he really has that sort of command. I would like to say, on a slightly unrelated note, but I did bring him up earlier, Simon Case, the cabinet secretary. I said I'd come back to him.
Yeah.
Because his name does seem to be popping up every now and then in these sort of things. Originally, like he's the highest level civil servant in the civil service. He was originally going to investigate the Partygate scandal until it came out in the media that he was implicated in the Partygate. He was at some of the parties.
He invited, I think, one of the parties he actually had invited them to.
Yeah. And it wasn't even until that was public knowledge that he decided to step aside. He knew that he was at the parties that he would be investigating himself. It took him till that goes public till he stepped aside. He's also the man who, again, was another facilitator in the £800,000 loan between Blythe and Sharp and Boris Johnson. And now he's supposed to be advising the Prime Minister on ethics, or he's supposed to be the final advice to the Prime Minister about ethical considerations and stuff like this, about this kind of thing. What on earth is he saying to Rishi? Is Rishi just completely not listening to him? Or is there something more there that Case is also, somewhat buddy-buddy with them all, a bit of a worrying appointment because he was appointed as Cabinet Secretary by Boris Johnson? Is there is there still some odd loyalties? Is he really doing his job of actually advising properly, ethically? Can he even advise ethically, seeing as, again, he was at the Partygate parties, he is implicated in other scandals as well. I just think it's a bit... It shows that in the corruption and poor governance of our current government, it's multifaceted, there's lots of problems.
Well, we're almost at the end of the show. Thank you, James, for making the links. I should reiterate that Nadhim Zahawi does say that it is an honest mistake that he's made. Our listeners can judge whether or not they believe that to be true. Before we go, Scarlett, do you want to plug the roundtable that you host?
Thank you. Before that, I'd just like to reinforce what James was saying about Simon Case, and I would say about the role of the civil service. There's been some reports out that there's, in a similar way to the BBC and this whole sort of media and establishment culture, is that civil servants get used to working with certain political parties and then almost become them and defenders of them, where again civil service is meant to be this politically neutral force, but we're finding the characters like Simon Case. I mean, if anyone's ever watched Yes Minister, they know that how much influence the cabinet secretary has over basically the whole entirety of government. So again, hopefully Simon Case gets shuffled off soon into some sort of dark room somewhere, which I hope is where Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nadine Dorries end up one day.
Well, both of them have slots on GB News and Talk TV, respectively.
Has anyone ever been as scared as when they saw Nadine Dorries and Jacob Rees-Mogg in front of Number 10 having their little interview saying Boris Johnson should come back? Because I was like, what is happening to this country? That was the moment where I was like... Anyway, also, Liz Truss's faction is called Trusketeers. And I can't get over that. Like, I need to find the humour in politics when it's all sort of dying. And you know what else I also talk about? You can hear me talk about politics, and you can also hear Felix as well. And James and Hannah, if they ever want to come on, is my podcast Roundtable, which you can also find on Spotify if you type in URN Roundtable. And we discuss the same things. We discuss politics. If you like what you heard today, you can hear even more of it.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Scarlett and Hannah, for coming on for the first time. And James, it's always a pleasure, of course, to have you and your insightful opinions on the big picture. We have been on University Radio Nottingham. I have been Felix Hawes. Thank you very much. And playing us out are, I think, some of the greatest music artists of planet Earth, I would say. Thank you. Bye-bye.